The Devil's Compass, Blood, Gold, and the Last Pirate King of the Caribbean, a 35-minute historical narrative. She had been at sea for 11 days when she first smelled the blood. Not gunpowder, not salt, not the rot of wet timber that had soaked into every plank of the ship. Blood. It drifted across the water before the ship itself appeared. Thick, copper sweet, carried on a wind that had no business blowing that gently on a morning that would end so badly. Her name was Catalina de Vega, 23 years old, the daughter of a Spanish colonial governor, and she was standing on the wrong deck. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happened on that morning in 1718, to understand why a Spanish governor's daughter was aboard a pirate vessel flying no flag at all, you have to go back. Back to a world on the edge of collapse. Back to a war that had bankrupted 3 empires and left 10,000 desperate men with nothing but the sea and their fury. Back to a man named Samuel Crowe. The year is 1713. The War of the Spanish Succession has just ended, and the Treaty of Utrecht has quietly destroyed the lives of every privateer in the Atlantic. For nearly a decade, men like Samuel Crowe had been paid, legally, officially, to attack enemy ships. They carried letters of marque from their governments. They were, technically, soldiers. Then the war ended, and overnight, 10,000 licensed killers found themselves unemployed. No back pay, no pension, no land, no future. The navies of England, France, and Spain simply released them into the world like a disease they no longer needed, and waited to see what would happen next. What happened next was the Golden Age of Piracy, and Samuel Crowe was about to become its darkest star. Samuel Crowe was not born to be a villain. That is the first thing you need to understand, and the thing that makes his story so impossible to look away from. He was born in Bristol, England, in 1685. The son of a rope maker. He learned the sea before he learned to read. By the age of 14, he was a sailor. By 17, he was a gunner's mate aboard a privateer vessel, hunting Spanish galleons in the Caribbean. He was good at it, terrifyingly good. Contemporary accounts describe him as tall, broad-shouldered, with a black beard he reportedly never cut after the age of 20. A deliberate choice, because he had noticed that a long, unkempt beard made men afraid. He was practical about fear, the way a carpenter is practical about wood. It was simply a tool. You shaped it into what you needed. But here is what those same accounts almost never mention. Samuel Crowe could read Latin. He carried a copy of Seneca in his coat pocket. He wrote letters, careful, literate letters, to his younger brother in Bristol every month without fail, right up until the year everything burned. He was not a monster who became a pirate. He was a man who became a monster because the world gave him no other door. The Treaty of Utrecht left Crowe stranded in Nassau, New Providence, a small island in the Bahamas that had become, almost accidentally, the capital of the pirate world. Nassau in 1713 was unlike any place on Earth. Picture a harbor crammed with ships of every nation flying no nation's flag. Picture a town of low wooden buildings and open fires, of stolen silks drying on fence posts next to stolen weapons, of men from 30 countries who had decided, collectively, quietly, that civilization had cheated them and they would build something else. There was a kind of democracy in Nassau that existed nowhere else in the world at that time. Pirates voted on their captains. They divided plunder by written contract. A ship's cook had a legal claim to the same share as the first mate. In a world where common men had no rights and no voice, the pirate ship was the most egalitarian institution on Earth. Samuel Crowe understood this, and he used it. Within 6 months of arriving in Nassau, he had a ship. Within a year, he had a crew of 80 men who would have followed him into hell. The ship was a converted Dutch fluid, 3 masts, wide-beamed, faster than it looked. He renamed her the Absolution. And for 2 years, the Absolution terrorized the Atlantic shipping lanes. Now, I need to stop here and introduce you to the second piece of this story. because every great story has two centers of gravity, and Samuel Crowe was only one of them. The other was Governor Rodrigo de Vega. De Vega was the Spanish crown's appointed governor of the island of Hispaniola, the most valuable piece of colonial territory in the Caribbean. He was 57 years old, enormously wealthy, politically connected to the court in Madrid, and genuinely, profoundly convinced that God had personally assigned him to bring order to the chaos of the New World. He was not a cruel man. He was something more dangerous than cruel. He was certain. And in 1715, his certainty was tested when a merchant convoy carrying 3 years' worth of colonial tax revenue, silver, gold, processed cochineal dye worth a fortune in Europe, was attacked in the Mona Passage by a ship flying no flag at all. The attack lasted 47 minutes. Every sailor survived. Only the cargo was taken. And on the main mast of the lead merchant vessel, the attackers left a single piece of paper, nailed there with a stiletto. It read, "The debt is paid, but the debt was never yours to collect." It was signed with a drawing of a compass, its needle pointing nowhere. Governor de Vega did not sleep for 3 days, and his daughter Catalina, who was 20 years old and had read the message over her father's shoulder, felt something move in her chest that she would spend 3 years trying to name. Let's talk about the world these people lived in, because without the physical reality of it, the story floats away into myth, and this is not a myth, this is history. A ship of the line in 1715 was the most complex machine human beings had ever built. A first-rate man-of-war carried 100 guns on 3 decks, required a crew of 800 men, and cost more to build than most European cathedrals. The cannons themselves, cast iron 6 feet long, some of them weighing over 3 tons, were loaded from the front, 1 shot at a time, while the ship rolled and the deck ran with seawater and the air turned white with smoke. A broadside from a large warship could fire 40 cannons simultaneously. The noise was not like thunder. People who survived it described it as something that happened inside the body. A pressure, a concussion, a sound that was also a physical blow. Ships did not fight from a distance. They closed to within 100 meters, sometimes less, close enough to see faces, close enough to hear voices. Then they fired. The mortality rate in a major naval engagement of this period was staggering. On the losing ship, 60 to 80% of the crew could die in 20 minutes. This is the world Samuel Crowe lived in. This is the world he chose. And he was extraordinarily good at surviving it. The first time Crowe and Catalina de Vega were in the same place was September of 1716, and neither of them knew it. Crowe had sailed the Absolution into the harbor at Santo Domingo under a false name and false papers, the ship disguised as a Portuguese merchant, the crew in civilian clothes, the guns hidden behind false cargo walls. He was there to buy information. There was a Spanish treasure fleet departing in 6 weeks. He needed the route. Catalina de Vega was there because her father was there. She accompanied him to a formal dinner at the governor's residence, a beautiful colonial building with a courtyard full of orange trees, where the sound of a Spanish guitar drifted through the evening air, and important men talked about important things, while their wives and daughters sat at the edges of rooms and listened. Catalina listened better than anyone in that house. She had been listening her whole life, to her father's dispatches, to his conversations with military commanders, to the reports that came in from sea captains describing what they had seen in the outer islands. She had built, in her mind, a detailed picture of the Caribbean that her father, surrounded by men who told him what he wanted to hear, had never managed to assemble. She knew, for instance, that the merchant Rodrigo Carvalho, who sat across from her at dinner that evening, charming and careful with his wine, had eyes that moved the wrong way, too deliberate, too controlled. She said nothing, but she remembered his face. The treasure fleet left Santo Domingo on November 3rd, 1716. It was attacked in the Windward Passage 11 days later. The Absolution came out of a squall line at dawn, running without lights, and was alongside the lead galleon before the watch had finished screaming. What followed was, by the standards of the era, almost surgical. Crowe had drilled his crew for this specific scenario for 3 months. They didn't want to sink the ships. They wanted the cargo. Dead sailors don't help you unload silver. Warning shots across the bow, then a broadside at the waterline, controlled, calibrated, sending a clear message. We can sink you, but we don't want to. Give us the cargo, and we let you live. The lead galleon surrendered in 14 minutes. The second ship did not. Its captain, a young Spanish naval officer named Diego Salazar, 26 years old, recently promoted, with everything to prove, chose to fight. What happened next took 41 minutes and killed 37 men. Diego Salazar was not among them. He survived, badly wounded, his right arm shattered by a splinter the size of a man's forearm, but alive. Crowe had him brought aboard the Absolution personally. According to his own journal, which survived and is held today in the National Maritime Museum in London, Crowe sat with Salazar for 2 hours while the surgeon worked and told him exactly why this was happening. I told him, Crowe wrote, that I bore him no ill will, that his bravery was notable and his misfortune was not of his making, that the men who had destroyed his future were not standing on my deck. They were sitting in palaces in Madrid and London, counting money that other men bled for. I told him I was the consequence, not the cause. Salazar survived. Crowe put him in a longboat with his men within sight of the Hispaniola coast and enough water for 3 days. Then he disappeared, back into the Atlantic. He left behind one thing, the same drawing, the compass pointing nowhere. Governor de Vega's response was immediate and total. He dispatched 4 warships. He tripled the naval patrols. He sent dispatches to every friendly port in the Caribbean, offering a reward of 5,000 pieces of 8 for information leading to the capture of the man who signed himself with a compass. He also did something that would change everything. He brought in an English hunter, Captain James Harwick, 41 years old, Royal Navy, a man who had spent 20 years hunting pirates in the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, and who was, by every account, as relentless, methodical, and remorseless as a tide. Harwick was not theatrical like Crowe. He did not make speeches or leave messages. He simply worked. He built networks of informants. He studied patterns. He waited. And he was very, very patient. The year 1717 changed Samuel Crowe. He had been at sea for nearly 4 years. He was 32 years old. He had more money than he could spend, and fewer places to spend it. He had watched 8 men from his original crew die, 2 in battle, 3 from fever, 2 from accidents at sea, 1 who simply walked into the jungle in Jamaica one morning and never came back. He had started doing something he'd never done before, thinking about what came after. In his journal that year, there is a passage that has been quoted by historians many times, but I want you to hear it fresh, the way it was written, in cramped, careful handwriting. On a night when the ship was riding at anchor off a small, uninhabited cay in the Bahamas, and the sea was so calm, it looked like poured glass. He wrote, I find myself wondering tonight if the compass I carry is truly pointing nowhere, as I have always claimed, or if it is pointing towards something I have not yet had the courage to name. A man can be free and still be lost. I was certain, once, that freedom was enough. I am less certain now. He was still in love with the sea. He was still extraordinary at what he did. But something had shifted. Some internal counterweight had moved, and he was not yet sure what it meant. What happened next, he would later describe as the worst decision and the best accident of his life. He sailed to Santo Domingo. He came, officially, for the same reason as before, information. There was talk of another fleet departure, another route he needed to know. But his first mate, a former Royal Navy boatswain named Thomas Greer, who had sailed with Crowe since Nassau and understood him better than Crowe understood himself, wrote in his own diary that Crowe spent the first 2 days in port, not meeting informants, but walking, just walking, through the market, through the cathedral square, along the waterfront, like a man looking for something he couldn't describe. He found it on the third day, the Orange Tree Courtyard. He had come to deliver a bribe to a mid-level port official, a routine transaction handled in 20 minutes. And on his way back through the governor's residence, he passed an open window. Through the window was a garden. In the garden was a woman sitting alone at a table with a map spread across it and a compass in her hand. She was making notes, corrections. Her handwriting was fast and certain. She looked up at exactly the wrong moment. Their eyes met through the open window. She was not afraid. That was the first thing he noticed. The absence of fear where fear should have been. She looked at him the way a cartographer looks at an unmapped coastline, with assessment and with interest. "You're walking too slowly for a merchant," she said, in accented English. He stopped. "And you're working too hard for a governor's daughter." A beat of silence, the kind of silence that has weight. "How do you know who I am?" she asked. "I make it my business to know who everyone is," he said. She looked at the compass in her hand, then back at him. "A compass," she said, very quietly, pointing nowhere. He was gone from that spot before she finished the sentence. But he did not leave Santo Domingo. He stayed for 8 more days. What followed over the next 4 months was one of the most reckless and improbable correspondences in the historical record of the Golden Age of Piracy. They wrote to each other. Catalina de Vega and Samuel Crowe exchanged 17 letters. Historians found them in 1943, sealed in an oilskin pouch inside a hidden compartment of a writing desk that had belonged to Catalina, sold at auction in Cadiz in 1791, and eventually donated to an archive in Seville. The letters are not what you would expect. They are not love letters. Not exactly. They are arguments, debates, two ferociously intelligent people who disagree about nearly everything. About justice, about empire, about what a human being owes the society that made them, conducting a furious philosophical duel across the pages, while underneath the argument, something else entirely is happening. She called him arrogant. He called her naive. She accused him of dressing up theft in the language of justice. He accused her of dressing up complicity in the language of loyalty. In his 4th letter, he wrote, "You defend a system that has stolen more than I ever will. The difference is that it steals with paperwork." In her reply, she wrote, "And you steal with romance. You dress your violence in ideology and call it freedom. You are not as different from my father as you believe. You simply chose a different uniform." He did not write back for 3 weeks. When he did, it was a single line. "You may be the first person who has ever frightened me." Captain Harwick was getting closer. He had assembled, by early 1718, a picture of the Absolution's movements over the past 3 years that was more detailed and accurate than anything the Spanish crown possessed. He knew the ship's dimensions. He knew its crew size. He had narrowed the captain's identity to 4 possibilities. He had informants in Nassau, in Tortuga, in Port Royal. And in January of 1718, one of those informants told him something very interesting. A tall English merchant, traveling under Portuguese papers, had been seen walking the streets of Santo Domingo for the better part of 2 weeks and had been observed twice in the vicinity of the governor's residence. Harwick did not rush. Harwick never rushed. He made a note. He watched. He waited. And he quietly began to wonder if the governor's own household might be the key he had been looking for. Meanwhile, the man Crowe trusted most in the world was about to betray him. Thomas Greer had sailed with Crowe for 6 years. He was 40 years old, thick-necked, with a red face and hands that could bend iron. He had been present at 17 engagements. He had never once shown fear. But Thomas Greer had a brother in Bristol who owed a debt to the wrong people, a debt that had grown, over years of interest, to a sum Greer could never pay honestly. And in February of 1718, someone offered to settle that debt, in exchange for one piece of information. Where would the absolution be on the 1st of March? Greer wrestled with it for 4 days. We know this because he wrote about it, a tortured, barely literate entry in his diary, full of crossings out and restarts. I have told myself 20 times that Sam would understand, he wrote. He would not. I have told myself that no one will die. I do not know this. I have told myself that the debt is not my fault. It does not matter whose fault it is. It must be paid. On February 19th, 1718, Thomas Greer sent a message to Captain James Harwick. The absolution would be in the harbor at Samana Bay, on the northeast coast of Hispaniola, between the 1st and 5th of March, taking on fresh water and provisions before a long Atlantic crossing. Harwick acknowledged receipt, settled the debt, and began moving his ships. Crowe did not know about the betrayal, but he knew something was wrong. He could feel it the way experienced sailors feel a shift in the weather, not through evidence, but through some aggregate of small signals that the conscious mind hasn't yet assembled into language. The crew was too quiet. Greer wouldn't meet his eyes. He wrote to Catalina in late February. The letter was short. I think I am about to make a catastrophic mistake. I have made all my decisions by compass, by cold reckoning. No sentiment, no attachment. The compass does not lie. But I find I am no longer certain what I am reckoning toward. If something happens to me, I want you to know that your 4th letter was correct. I have been wearing a different uniform, not a better one. He never seen it. He found it in his own coat pocket 2 days later and read it twice and decided it was too much truth for paper. March 1st, 1718, Samana Bay, Hispaniola. The absolution was anchored 300 meters from the beach. Her crew divided between the ship and the shore, half filling water barrels, half making repairs to the foremast that had taken damage in a storm 2 weeks prior. It was mid-morning. The light was flat and white and hazy. The first shot came from the east, then from the west, then from directly behind. 3 ships, all Royal Navy, all under Captain James Harwick's command. They had come in from 3 directions simultaneously, having spent the night moving into position under minimum sail in complete silence. It was, by any military standard, a masterpiece of planning. The absolution had 73 men aboard and 10 guns in firing position. Harwick had 3 warships totaling 214 guns. There was no version of this that ended well. What followed, according to accounts from both sides, was 9 minutes of some of the most ferocious resistance anyone present had ever witnessed. Crowe's crew, outnumbered 4-1, with no realistic chance of escape, fought as though the outcome was still in question. The absolution fired until her gun decks were waist-deep in smoke. She took 17 direct hits. She caught fire twice. She never struck her colors. In the 9th minute, a British cannonball passed directly through the main cabin below decks and destroyed, among other things, the compass Crowe had carried since Nassau. He found it afterward. The case shattered, the needle broken cleanly in 2. He put both halves in his pocket. The battle ended not with surrender, but with stillness. The fire was extinguished, the guns went silent, and when the smoke cleared enough to see, Harwick's men came aboard the absolution to find 21 dead, 31 wounded, and 21 men standing on a deck slick with blood and seawater, weapons still in hand, going nowhere. Samuel Crowe was among the standing. He had a cut across his left cheek, a broken rib, and the expression, according to one British lieutenant who recorded the moment, of a man who has worked out the answer to a very long equation and does not like the result. He did not speak when they took his weapons. He did not speak when they put him in irons. He looked at Thomas Greer, who was also in irons, because Harwick trusted no one, which was why Harwick was so good at his job, and Greer looked away. Crowe looked away too. There was nothing left to say. News of the capture reached Santo Domingo within 5 days. Catalina de Vega heard it from her father, who told her at breakfast with considerable satisfaction, not knowing, or perhaps choosing not to know, the particular quality of her silence as he spoke. She excused herself. She went to her room. She opened the writing desk. She took out the 17 letters. She read them all, in order, from first to last. Then she put them in the hidden compartment and locked it. And she walked to her father's office and told him she wanted to attend the trial. The trial of Samuel Crowe took place in Nassau in the spring of 1718, part of the Royal Navy's broader campaign to destroy the pirate republic that had flourished there for a decade. The new governor of Nassau was Woodes Rogers, a former privateer himself, pragmatic, unsentimental, determined to clean out the harbor and restore British order. His famous motto, "Piracy expelled, commerce restored." Rogers had offered pardons to any pirate who surrendered. Some took them, many didn't. Crowe refused the pardon. At his trial, he was calm, articulate, and utterly unrepentant. He conducted much of his own defense, in English and in Latin, which caused a considerable stir in the courtroom. He questioned witnesses with precision. He cited maritime law, treaty obligations, the terms of his original privateering commission. He made the prosecution work for every point. In the end, it didn't matter. The evidence was overwhelming. The verdict was inevitable. He was sentenced to hang. Catalina de Vega had 4 days. What she did with them is a matter of some historical controversy. The official record says nothing. 2 secondary sources, a merchant's diary and a ship's log, mention, in passing, that a woman matching her description was seen near the jail twice in the 3 days before the execution. What is certain is this: on the night before the execution, the jail guard on duty reported that his supper wine tasted strange. He slept for 11 hours without waking, and in the morning, the cell was empty. Samuel Crowe was never seen again, not conclusively, not in any way that the historical record can confirm. There were sightings. There were always sightings. A tall English-speaking man in the French Caribbean port of Martinique in 1719. A retired sailor in Bristol who claimed to have received a letter from a man he refused to name, postmarked from somewhere in the Azores in 1721. A drawing, crude, done from memory, found in a Bahamian archive labeled only "The Compass Man," that bears a strong resemblance to the one confirmed portrait of Crowe that exists. What happened to Catalina de Vega is clearer, and in some ways, more astonishing. She returned to her father's house. She told him nothing. She lived quietly for 2 years, under a cloud of suspicion that no one could make stick because no one had proof. Then, in 1720, she sailed for Spain, ostensibly to visit relatives in Seville. She never came back. In the archive in Seville, the last letter in the hidden compartment of her writing desk, a letter that was not written by her, reads simply, "The debt is paid. The compass is pointing. S." Was Samuel Crowe a hero? No. He was a thief. He killed men, he operated outside the law by choice, and he profited from violence. But he also lived in a world that was itself built on theft and violence. A world of empires that stripped continents of their wealth, of treaties that discarded human lives like spoiled cargo, of systems that took everything from men like him and called the taking legal. The Golden Age of Piracy lasted roughly from 1715 to 1726. In that decade, men like Crowe, Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, Charles Vane, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, created something that had never existed before. A floating society outside the reach of kings, where common men made their own rules. It was violent, it was brutal, it was frequently unjust, but it was theirs. The empires crushed it, eventually. The hangings at Nassau were meant as a message. They were also, in a quieter way, an admission. These people had built something that scared you. Something that refused to be told where to point. Blackbeard, Edward Teach, died in November 1718, the same year Crowe was captured. He was killed in a violent engagement off the coast of North Carolina. The accounts say he took 5 musket balls and 20 sword wounds before he fell. Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate in the Atlantic, was killed in 1722. He reportedly died on deck, dressed in his finest clothes, as if he had known it was coming and refused to meet it any other way. Mary Read died in prison. Anne Bonny's fate is unknown. Some accounts say she was pardoned, others that she simply vanished, which feels appropriate. The Golden Age ended. The Atlantic became, once again, a road owned by empires. But something remained. The idea of it. The compass. The notion that a group of desperate, discarded men could look at the world that had thrown them away and say, "We are going to build something else, out here, where you can't follow." That idea did not die in Nassau. It never really dies. There is one final thing I want to leave you with. In the National Maritime Museum in London, there is a display case in room 17. Inside that case, among other artifacts of the Golden Age of Piracy, is a broken compass. The case is shattered, the needle is in 2 pieces. The accession record lists it as recovered from the wreck of a ship called the Absolution, raised from Samana Bay in 1953. Below the compass, the museum has written a small card. It reads, "Owner unknown." I find that hard to believe. I think the compass always knew exactly where it was pointing. We were just too far away to see it. This has been Cold Reckoning. If this story moved you, if you found yourself somewhere in it, share it. Leave a comment. Tell us who you think Samuel Crowe really was. Was he a criminal? A revolutionary? A man who fell in love and couldn't find his way back to the person he'd been before? Maybe all 3. Next time on Cold Reckoning, the real story of Anne Bonny, the Irish governor's daughter who became the most feared name in the Caribbean, and the woman who sailed beside her, and the love story, the history books buried for 300 years. You don't want to miss it. Cold Reckoning. No sentiment, just the truth. And the truth, as always, is stranger than the legend.